I'm heartbroken about the way things went in Afghanistan. Powerful armies invaded this country with slogans about peace, democracy, women's rights. It was a disaster. Now the foreign troops are withdrawing. Whatever they leave behind, so far, it's not peace. My name is Graeme Smith. I came here as a young Canadian war correspondent more than 15 years ago. I followed troops into battle. I took thousands of photographs. Spent years smelling the death. The charred flesh of suicide bombers got stuck in the treads of my shoes. Why would I come back to a place that gave me nightmares? I want to see if there's hope for peace. Not just peace among the Afghan people, not just an end to the carnage. I'm also looking for a way to reconcile myself with the terrible things that we, the foreigners, inflicted on this beautiful country. Maybe a personal kind of peace. I first came to Afghanistan in 2005, and I stayed for many years after that as an analyst for NGOs and the United Nations. It was exciting for a kid in his 20s to go to a dusty, faraway place, what felt like the edges of civilization. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. First arrived, it felt like a cowboy frontier town.
It wasn't unusual to hear people saying, oh, this is like the opening scene in Star Wars, you know, with all of the crazy characters walking around.
Spies, mercenaries, journalists, everyone you can possibly imagine was crowding into Kabul in the early years of the war. We were all following the footsteps of the American invasion in October 2001. The Taliban had been harboring al-Qaeda leaders who plotted the 9/11 attacks in New York City.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. The name of today's military operation is Enduring Freedom.
I don't know now if there is such a thing as a good war, but definitely at the time there was a feeling that the war in Afghanistan was noble somehow.
Pushing back the forces of darkness in Afghanistan. They were pushing back the forces of evil and barbarism.
I was swept up in this fantasy that gripped everyone in Afghanistan, all the foreigners, and frankly the entire Western world at that time. It was a kind of romantic notion, a flawed romantic notion. Back then, none of us really knew much about the Taliban. They had started as conservative religious students based in the southern province of Kandahar. Many had taken up arms against the Soviet troops that occupied Afghanistan in the 1980s. But once the Soviets were driven out, a vicious civil war erupted among rival political factions in the 1990s. The Taliban emerged as the dominant force in this chaos, sweeping the country and capturing Kabul in 1996. Once in power, they closed girls' schools, banned music and television. They forced women to wear the burqa and executed people for minor transgressions. Dozens of countries eagerly supported America's war in Afghanistan, and the US-led coalition expanded to more than 100,000 troops. One of the soldiers I came to know was Aisha Wollesmal. Born in Norway, she often visited family in Afghanistan. She joined the Norwegian Army in 2006. We arranged to meet one morning in the garden of a heavily protected compound in Kabul.
What was that like, putting on the uniform?
Fantastic. It's very emotional. Even though I was very young, I immediately had this like feeling that I can, be a bridge maker somehow, because I grew up in a very conservative, traditional Pashtun family. And I picked up on a lot of like cultural kind of nuances, that whole kind of tribal thinking. I have to admit, I wasn't that intellectually invested in the whole peace and democracy aspect of it. It was more the immediate, relief for the population as I saw it.
You're sort of saving the people from the Taliban. Basically.
Yeah, exactly. So that was a very kind of strong sentiment.
At first, it all seemed easy. In a little more than 2 months, Western armies drove the Taliban from power.
And I remember music playing. Afghans love music. As soon as the regime was toppled, I felt that, okay, now the world has access to Afghanistan. And Afghanistan has access to the world, to all the impulses that help a country move in the right direction. Practically, that meant, development projects coming in. Girls going to school, as something as basic as that.
Much has changed, especially for the lucky few that live in cities. Foreign troops and foreign aid brought new freedoms and new opportunities. But today, Kabul is again a city on edge. The Taliban, once defeated, can now strike at any time. People try to go about their daily lives, but there's always the danger of a truck bomb or a suicide attack.
It's the first time coming to Kabul that I've hired a B6 armored vehicle. We've got the bulletproof glass, the armor-plated doors. You can spray the tires with bullets and it'll keep driving. In some ways it feels like overkill, but that's the reality now.
I happen to know the man in charge of all this security. I met Hamdullah Mohib years ago when he was an aide to a presidential candidate. Now, only 37 years old, he is the national security advisor to the president.
Attacks here have caused massive casualties. People feel fearful. It has a psychological impact when you live like this. Every day, my heart is pumping, worried about my children until they come back from school.
Like many young Afghans in positions of power today, Mohib fled his homeland as a child. He lived in a refugee camp in Pakistan, but was one of the lucky ones who got an education in the West. Then he returned home to try to rebuild his country.
My generation grew up in this war, and all we want to see is to be able to do the normal things that everyone else takes for granted.
Mohib gets daily briefings from his generals who tell him that they are winning the war. But 20 years of fighting has settled nothing. You could sense that even more when you leave Kabul and head south to Kandahar, where I spent most of my time as a reporter.
For me, it was really important to cover all sides of the conflict. So spending time with Afghan security forces, trying to hear what the Taliban had to say, to go, what they say, outside the wire, beyond the razor wire fence that surrounds the military camps, and just listen to ordinary people.
Kandahar is where the Taliban first emerged, and it remains very conservative. Women in public pretty much always wear the traditional burqa. And yet here is where, with Western aid money, a friend of mine tried something bold. In a quiet corner of the city, these girls escape behind the high walls of this private school. They take off their burqas to attend classes in English and learn computer skills.
Salam alaikum, Haji Sahab.
Brother Graeme. Life is good. Life is good, and we see you again. You're
nice
welcome.
So nice.
So nice to
I've
see
known
you.
the school's director,
I'm
Asnul
fine.
Essa,
How are
for
you?
years.
Thank you so much.
How
You
is
look even
everything?
younger than before.
Oh, yeah.
How is it possible? We
So
wanted to give you a
good.
little surprise.
So good. It's so good. It is a surprise.
But you're still here.
I'm still here. I'm still surviving. It's definitely hard. It's very risky here to help all these women get education, and especially modern education, to go out and work, to be self-sustained, to be independent. This is something unacceptable for extremists. For example, you are developing a magazine, right? Writing a magazine. So in the magazine, you need to put some photos, or you are doing a report.
These days, foreign money has dried up for his school as Canada and other Western donors lose interest in Afghanistan.
Is happening?
His school has gone from more than 2,000 female
Very good.
students a year to
Bring this
200,
here.
and he struggles
Under
to
the
give the
picture.
young girls hope.
There is violence against women in some countries, and Afghanistan is one of them.
These girls are here because their families want them to get a broad education. In today's English class, Soraya and her classmates have an assignment on violence against women, a radical topic here in the traditional South. Now it's the turn of 12-year-old Shabnam.
Islam has given women the right to work, study, and get education. I request every family to let women to study, work, and get education, to shine one day and achieve their dreams. Let them fly like birds and be honored one day. Thanks a lot. I come here to learn English because of that English can improve our life.
I'm safe in school, but not outside.
It's not safe outside for women or anyone else, really. International troops fought and died to protect this city, and yet now it's under siege, once again, by the Taliban. Police are constantly on the lookout for insurgents and suicide bombers. They guard the city, but they can barely protect themselves. 3 police officers are assassinated here in Kandahar every week. And across the country, in some weeks, hundreds of security personnel are killed.
So just now, 20 minutes ago, another target killing. Yet again, some gunmen on a motorcycle shot and killed an off-duty police officer. It's amazing the pace of these things.
Even if the police are targets, we have no choice. We still need to rely on them for our safety. With 2 truckloads of armed men, we drive less than 30 minutes to the front lines in the Panjwai Valley. This is where I first started to understand that there would be no military solution to this war. International forces under NATO command surged into the south back in 2006 and started digging in for what would be the war's bloodiest battles.
I think I slept in that shelter over there. This used to be a Canadian base. It's called Masumgar, and now there's hardly anything left. It's like a ghost town.
This landscape haunts me. I almost died in this valley. I remember the bone-jarring intensity of the explosions. battle after battle, I witnessed the same pattern. Foreign troops hammering away with modern firepower, the Taliban coming back again and again and again with nothing more sophisticated than stubbornness.
Canadian troops here have been very successful. The Taliban cannot win, and they are a desperate organization.
Politicians and generals kept hailing the Afghan mission as a spectacular success. But looking back, it was really a string of failures. The Taliban were never defeated. They just retreated and then launched a renewed insurgency that grew and engulfed the whole country. In my reports back then, I tried to sound a note of caution, but I often felt like a lonely voice in a crowd of media cheerleaders. I really questioned my own sanity sometimes in Afghanistan. I could see things were happening in front of me, and I was trying to write them down and put them in the newspaper. And then military officers and government PR people would sort of tell me, no, that's not what you saw. It was a head-spinning experience.
And I think that's what happens in a war where countries get swept up in this fervor and they don't care what's true. They want to know, how great are our boys? How true is our cause? And I think that's the madness of war.
For my country, Canada, the madness would go on for 5 more years. It withdrew from Afghanistan in 2011, with 158 soldiers dead and at least 1,800 injured. I began to question whether those sacrifices were worth it. I also began to realize that while fighting what we saw as evil, that we ourselves had sometimes crossed the line into darkness. I had to go back to where I first saw that darkness. Maybe more than any other single place, where I really started to lose faith in the war in Afghanistan was inside the crumbling jail cells of Sarposa prison on the west side of Kandahar city.
Some of the stories I heard inside these walls, I can't forget. They're still with me.
The prison has always housed common criminals, but also plenty of political prisoners. You can hear the murmuring of men here inside the political section of the prison. That's where they keep the Taliban. When I first came here in 2007, I interviewed 30 detainees, the majority of them suspected Taliban. Many of them captured by Canadian soldiers and transferred over to the Afghan authorities. I spoke to men who showed me the scars on their bodies. They told me they were beaten, choked, frozen, whipped. There was one guy who'd been beaten so badly that he'd forgotten who he was. Terrible things happened to these prisoners when they were being interrogated. This shook me because it wasn't an accident of war. It was deliberate. It was a part of the design of the war. On a daily basis, prisoners transferred from Canadian custody into cruel hands.
No evidence of the specific allegations in the Globe and Mail.
Why was this information not brought up in this House before?
My stories caused uproar, debate, and investigations.
They will inform us.
The Afghan and Canadian governments tried to deny that torture was happening.
No evidence there is any access blocked to the
Pourquoi n'avez-vous pas eu les mêmes exigences?
And it really started to change the way that I thought about the war. This was kind of a turning point for me in my whole thinking about the conflict.
Then came the revelations of all the abuses and the corruption of our supposed allies. A lot of the Western aid money for schools and hospitals never really reached the people. In recent years, poverty's gotten worse. More than half the population now lives below the national poverty line. These days, what separates squalor from splendor are guards and gates. The drug trade, stolen aid money, all kinds of schemes have made Afghanistan one of the world's most corrupt countries. It can be hard at times to tell the difference between the supposed good guys and the bad guys. You hear that a lot these days in Afghanistan. That's what Aisha Wolasmal discovered once she took off her soldier's uniform.
When I was in a uniform, my entire understanding of the situation was a very kind of security-based understanding. But it was only when I actually came back to Afghanistan as a civilian, you know, as Aisha, Masuma's daughter, that I got a reality check.
In the villages, people told her about being terrified of foreign troops or Afghan government forces as they hunted for the Taliban.
I remember so many stories about my relatives telling me about how their sons were just taken out in the middle of the nights, you know, in front of their mothers, where black paper bags were placed on their heads and they disappeared. Even 2 weeks ago, I met with people not fearing night raids by the American, but the Americans have trained the Afghans that well that now the Afghans are doing it. Sadly, that's everyday life, the bloodshed. I mean, the sons, the husbands, the fathers, but also the young children. I mean, it's absolutely devastating.
This is where they count the numbers and track the abuses. The Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission. It says a lot about the situation that any sort of official building looks like a fortress with intense security checks. My good friend Shahrazad Akbar heads the commission.
People have these ideas about human rights being a Western concept. I grew up in a family with parents that really believed in human rights. Striving to create a universe where all humans are treated with respect and with dignity, this was very, very central to the values that I was taught since I was very little. So for me, it was very important to have an opportunity to work for human rights because I believe that this value is really deep-rooted in Afghanistan, in our religion and in our culture.
Akbar's family spent the Taliban years in a refugee camp. Her parents firmly believed in education for women, and she went on to become the first Afghan woman to study at Oxford University.
The future of human rights more broadly.
At 33 years old, she's probably the leading human rights advocate in Afghanistan.
For our international partners.
What bothers Akbar these days is the sheer level of carnage inflicted by both sides.
What's of course very disturbing is that Afghanistan continues to be a site of gross human rights violations, from civilian casualties caused by all sides involved in the conflict, including international forces and the Afghan government, having far-reaching consequences for how we are as a society and how we will be in the future. On a whole range of human rights issues that we work on, the footprint of the war is there.
The numbers are staggering. Since the war began in 2001, hundreds of thousands have been killed. No one knows the exact count. A cemetery for bodies that are unclaimed, unidentified, unknown. It was a sad enough place when I visited a dozen years ago, and today it is unbelievably bigger. More people are killed in this war every year than in any other conflict in the world. back to you in unexpected ways. I remember one night I was attending a play and I started crying, and I wept and I wept. I hadn't cried like that in years. I really, really want this war to end. NATO is the most powerful alliance in human history by some measures, but military efforts to bring peace and stability have failed. The Taliban have only grown stronger. In propaganda videos posted on their website, the Taliban claim they are well-armed, well-trained, they can strike anywhere, and they do.
The jihad, sangar.
To find out how the Taliban are pulling it off, I went to see my good friend Rahmatullah Amiri, one of the country's most respected political analysts.
Taliban are not just only getting stronger, they're getting organized. They're becoming some sort of a conventional kind of army. Sure. If you compare the Taliban of today versus the Taliban of 2014, you see a much different group. From experience traveling across the country, I would say in terms of terrain, Taliban control between 50 to 60% of the country under their full control. That's what I would say, their full control. The government needs to accept Taliban as a very strong, powerful force. They cannot treat them as a bunch of, insurgents who are outside there. No, they have a very strong system, both civilian and military system that is right now running almost half of the country.
It's hard to get a sense of the Taliban's real power because it's dangerous for an outsider like me to travel into the vast territory they control. One night in Kandahar, we arranged to meet Abdullah, a former Taliban commander who grew weary of fighting, but who still stays in touch with his former comrades. For his own safety, we are concealing his identity. We hire him to take a cell phone camera into a Taliban region not far from Kandahar city.
You have to keep everything on this little chip here.
It'll be good.
Local fighters allowed him to film these images. They want to show the outside world how secure they feel in their strongholds. These days, the Taliban allow girls to join the boys and study at the local religious school. But many families pull their girls out of classes when they reach puberty. And these students are just memorizing verses from the Quran, not really getting a broad education. This Taliban commander wants to hide his face, but he has a message to broadcast on television. This is not an empty boast. Intelligence estimates say the Taliban now dominate much of the countryside, with only major cities under government control and under constant threat. The resurgence of the Taliban frightens many people, particularly the urban middle class. many women are fearful of losing their hard-fought freedoms. And I was curious about the young generation of people who grew up surrounded by foreign troops and foreign aid. So I came here to Kabul University. Maryam and her friend Adiba study photography in a country where the Taliban had once banned cameras, and they have no intention of letting anyone turn back the clock.
خب یک تضاد واقعا یک تضاد خیلی بزرگ به وجود میاد. حالا من به همچین موضوعی در خانواده هم مواجه هستم، چون فعلا در خانواده فقط یگانه کسی که همچین فکر داره تنها خودم هستم و خانواده خیلی مذهبی دارم. حالا خواهر و برادرها باشه جایش خواهر حتی همین مفکوره را دارند که اصلا اهمیت نمیدم برشون، چون میفهمم که موضوعی نیست که قابل ارزشی را داشته باشه، اهمیتی را داشته باشه و من ذهن خودم کوشش میکنم به این موضوع اصلا درگیری نکنم.
Despite these struggles, this generation dreams big and also small, with personal goals that are breathtakingly modest.
چون فعلا هزار یک کار اصلا وقتا نبوده شرایط مناسب نمیتونم. مثلا از یک کالای دلخواه خودم شروع میکنم، از یک لباس دلخواه.
What clothes would you want to wear?
Which color?
لباس چی؟
I myself like men's clothes.
Mini skirts?
Men clothes, suits.
Men's clothes. Oh, okay. دریشی.
در کل یک موضوع از نگاه پوشش است و مطمئن هستم به خاطر زمین مشکل در این مشکل همگی مواجه هستن. از نگاه پوشش حداقل من میگم من دوست دارم رنگ‌های تیز بپوشم، رنگ نارنجی، رنگ زرد، رنگ سرخ. میتونه باور کنید من روزی که یک مثلا رنگ نارنجی بپوشم یا رنگ سبز حداقل در ترکیب لباسم باشه روزم خیلی خوبتر میشه. Something like this.
I want to go meet someone who is a role model for many of these young women. She's the most famous feminist in the country.
So, Wagga, your phone just pinged. Something just happened. Another explosion.
Yeah, in PD12, there was a blast, and we still don't know if it has harmed anyone or not.
This kind of security used to be only embassies that did this. We're in what's known as an airlock, heavy steel doors that are closed on both sides of the driveway, and they're never open at the same time. And so you're in a little metal box, basically, just in case the car explodes while it's being checked.
Faranaz Frotan is only 28, but she's one of Afghanistan's best-known television journalists.
I notice you have Frida Kahlo everywhere.
Forotan revels in provocation. She decorates her office with the work of Mexican artist Frida Kahlo, selecting images that would shock most people in this conservative society.
Is another Frida Kahlo?
من بسیار فریدا کالو را خوش دارم. نظر به سبک کارش، زندگیش یک سوپر وومن است بر من.
خانم بسیار قوی است.
بسیار. با وجود از اینکه صحبت شما درد و رنج بسیار زیاده تجربه کرده بود و در تمام زندگیش رنج و غم بسیار زیاد بود، ولی همیشه امیدوار بود، همیشه با عشق زندگی کرد، همیشه با انگیزه زندگی کرد و به نظر من زندگی را شکست داد.
That's like you.
نمیفهمم.
She used her fame to launch a social media campaign called My Red Line.
من میخواهم به عنوان یک انسان در هر نقطه این سرزمین حق انتخاب آزاد داشته باشم. صلح برایم گسترش فرصت ها باشه، نه وضع محدود.
Asking people to talk about the lines that they are not willing to cross for the sake of peace.
خط سرخ شما چیست؟
ما خط سرخ به خاطر از بیان نمی کنیم که طالب ایره قبول بکنه یا نکنه. ما خط سرخ به خاطر از بیان می کنیم که این حق ماست که در مورد از این گپ بزنیم و این چیز در جامعه وجود داره، از آزادی های فردی گرفته تا حقوق زنها گرفته تا حقوق اقلیت ها گرفته، این در جامعه ما هست. طالب این چیزها را باید بشنوه و باید به این فکر بکنه که افغانستان امروز افغانستان 5 سال دوره طالب نیست.
She has traveled across the country, collecting videos with messages of defiance.
خو ګرد به سره یې ورونه یې او که دی ورته وایي چې ښځې دې وظیفه نه کوي، عسکري دې نه کوي، ښځې دې خدمت نه کوي، مکتب دې نه یي، دا خو هېڅوک نه ورسره مني، دا خو څوک نه ورسره مني.
ولی در مجموع بحث ما تنها بحث چادر نیست، بحث احترام به یک انسان است. ولی وقتی که شما در اینجا قدر کشته شدین، شما که در کشور بسیار توسعه یافته و پیشرفته زندگی میکنین، آیا این بر شما قابل قبول است که به یک گروهی که هیچ شناختی از اونا ندارین و هیچ راهی از اونا را نمیفهمین فرصت از این بتین که بیاین در اینجا حاکمیت کنن، حقوق زنها را در نظر نگیرن، حقوق انسانها را در نظر نگیرن و تمام دستاوردهای مردم افغانستان و حمایت های شما را از بین ببرن؟
My Red Line has generated dozens of videos with tens of thousands of followers on social media, but it is mostly an urban phenomenon in a country that is mainly rural.
Obviously, there's a lot more at stake for women here. You know, they've come a really long way, and they're right to be really scared of what a Taliban government would look like. I would struggle to sleep at night if I was one of them.
Raised in the Western world, Aisha Wolasmal understands the fears of urban women. She's no longer a soldier. She now works with rural women in the villages. That gives her a different perspective.
That fear is, very different from the fear that women in the rural areas have. It's because they haven't had the same level of progress there. They haven't gone from like their mud house to become like parliamentarians.
Yeah.
They're still in that same mud house. Illiteracy rates are extremely high. There's still girls that are being married off at age 14. So life hasn't changed. And I always notice this throughout my travels. The more remote places you visit, the more it becomes evident that the discussion at central level is very removed from the realities of rural Afghanistan.
I wanted to meet women like that, but local traditions make it very hard for a foreigner, let alone a man. So I asked Wolasmal to introduce me to her friend, Dr. Aziza Watawal Azizi, and I went to see her in Kandahar. Azizi was part of an older generation of women who came of age in the 1970s, before Afghanistan plunged into war. She studied and practiced medicine in Europe, and then she came back to care for the poorest families at a clinic in Kandahar. Women from all over the province walked through her doors.
سولې او د جنگ اغلورترین مقام دی بیرته د سولې خبرې شروع سي او موږ د دې مرغۍ د سولې مرغۍ چې موږ څخه الوتې ده موږ بیرته ونیسو او موږ خاوندان سو.
Dr. Azizi invited a group of women she knows to a tea party at her home, a rare occasion for these women to talk to a foreign man, and an even rarer opportunity for me to hear their point of view. In Kabul, we interviewed some women who don't wear burqa and they don't wear hijab even. They say this war is about freedom against peace. If peace comes and the Taliban come back to Kabul, they will lose their freedom. And I want to know if the women here feel the same way.
ټول دنیا د خپل سول مخاشه د چې سول چې اره کوم ژوند انسان کو یغه سم مجون کو کوم مخلصي کپټي مونږ دا ژوند چې دی اره کوم خوشحالي سره چې شدي
امروز دا هر کوم اې شي دا مخ د لیب ټیږي از مجون دا غي خوشه د مخ چې پټ شدي مخ لس مخ مجون دا د بوره خوشه د پر سر دی کنه واز مخ خپل خوشه د پر سر ني د یعنی چادري او یا مخلصي یوازې د ازادي معنا نه لري ازادي اقتصادي ازادي ده ازادي چې تعلیم وکړي ازادي چې هغه انساني اساسي حقوق ترلاسه کړي په ټولنه کې دا ازادي ده یوازې مخلصي یا پتلون اغوستل یا درشي کول دا ازادي نه ده ازادي دغه ده چې اکثریت د ټولنې ازادي واخلي ترلاسه کړي.
I think in foreign countries the people think if Taliban come back to take a share of power that it will be bad for women, that women are afraid of the Taliban coming back. But these women are not afraid, I think. Can we ask why?
بیا په هغه ملکو کې خو بیا موږ نه یې نه لرو ملکو سره خو موږ کار نه لرو هغه کې بیا دغه دی په موږ کې بیا دا روایت دی دلته په زموږ په کندهار کې په ارغنداب کې دا خو زموږ دغه دی دا زموږ خپله رضا ده موږ په دا خوشحاله چې سوله وسي زموږ الکان فعاله سي زموږ مؤمنان فعاله سي زموږ کورونه جوړ سي زموږ ملک جوړ سي
هغه خو نو بیا د هغو کار دی نو هغه خو موږ اوس موږ دغه نه دی چې وزیره شوم زه خپله اوس په دغسې یم د دغه چادرۍ څه دغسې یم دی بیزار یم دا اوس مې لنډوله سر درد دی چې وګه سره چې وزیره سره چې ګرده یو مخ ګرده سمې دی ګرده یو مخ ته ورونو سره ګرځي زما دغسې ما ته چې مشرتوب راکړي زه دغسې کوم زه د خپلې چادرۍ څه اوس لا بیزار یم چې سر مې ته
در دغه لا پنډه ته چادري واغوندو
بالا بارا نه راو بالا هغه وخت زه سپین سرې کېږم ملاکه راته چې تر دغه پنډه چادرې
Even here, under anonymous burqas behind high walls, everyone has their own ideas about the key to peace. Over the mountains, more than 1,000 kilometers away, those divergent ideas about peace in Afghanistan are being debated in a city that feels like a different world. Doha, the capital of Qatar. I've been shot at by the Taliban, nearly kidnapped a couple of times, so it feels strange to come here and arrange interviews with them. On the corner of a quiet street, you can find something remarkable. A kind of unofficial embassy and headquarters for the Taliban, with the support of the Qatari government. They've been here since 2013, a sign of how far they've come diplomatically. The Taliban meet openly with visiting delegations, plan their political strategy, and educate the next generation. I was curious to meet the younger Taliban thinkers. Ammar Zmarak is 35 years old. Like a lot of new leaders who work in the Taliban's political office, he's well educated and worldly. He works diligently to spread the movement's message. The Taliban once banned television, but now they have a sophisticated web presence, active on social media in Pashto, Dari, English, and Arabic.
We are the age of technology. In our elder time, even in all over the world, there were not as much technology as we have now. So due to technology, there is more knowledge, there is more education, there is more progress in any field. So we are more progressive than the past generation. When the world gave an opportunity to us to prove ourselves to the world, what we are and what we want, they will be surprised, and they will find us very
different than we expected.
Different.
The United States has been waging war against the Taliban for almost 2 decades. More than 2,400 dead U.S. soldiers. Young men sent to fight and die who were not even born when the war started in 2001. A desperate America needed to change strategy. After decades of refusing to talk openly with the Taliban, the US began to do just that. In 2018, the Americans came to Doha to start official negotiations with the Taliban, without the Afghan government. Majid Mashal covered the story for the New York Times. Born in Kabul, he's one of the best journalists in Afghanistan. He says the stunning reversal came about because the Americans felt trapped.
The news had tied in too much.
The military news.
The military news. The Taliban sort of gain of territory, the Taliban's confidence. There's an acknowledgement of the fact internationally that they're a power to reckon with.
So the Americans were forced to reckon with Taliban stalwarts, like this leader, Khairullah Khairkhwah, who was the Taliban's interior minister and a provincial governor.
او اوس هغه زموږ سره ناستي او پر میز باندې خبرې را سره کوي او دوی موږ تر هغوی ښه پېژندلو ته امریکایانو چې موږ تورستان نه یو موږ غواړو د همدې وجې لکه کوم څوک چې په سنګر کې هلته دغه دپاره دغه یو هدف دپاره کوشش کوي چې په خپل وطن کې امن راسي او اسلامي نظام راسي موږ هم دلته په خبرو کې هم دغه زموږ مهم دی چې باید موږ یې مخ ته بوځو.
Captured shortly after the fall of the Taliban regime in 2001, Khairkhwah spent 12 years in the American military prison at Guantanamo. His detention file describes him as a trusted and respected Taliban official, a high risk to US interests. But he was set free by the Americans in a prisoner exchange. Khairkhwah went from wearing a prison jumpsuit to more dignified clothing at five-star hotels. Khairkhwah became a key player in the Taliban's talks with the Americans. Surrounded by lush gardens and palm trees, the Taliban negotiators, many of whom had been imprisoned and tortured, found themselves face to face with US military commanders.
It's a really, really odd, bizarre image around the table. You have people in uniform at the table, people who've been involved in, special operations, people who are very well known for the kind of, kill capture missions and things like that. On the other side, you have pretty much half of the Taliban delegation, some of the most key negotiators who've spent, a decade in orange jumpsuits in Guantanamo. Now, the two of them sitting across as equals.
Not quite equals, maybe, but by negotiating directly with the Taliban, the Americans outraged many of their allies in the Afghan government. Not surprisingly, back in Kabul, National Security Advisor Hamdullah Mohib, who spent his life fighting the Taliban, felt betrayed.
I think what the Taliban would achieve out of this was legitimacy. That's goal number one. Establish yourself as the legitimate savior of Afghanistan, who has defeated a superpower and freed the country from their invasion. Once you have legitimized yourself and delegitimized everybody else, then you want to negotiate. That is not negotiations, that is a surrender.
Activist Faranaz Forotan is doing her best to stand in their way. Her My Red Line campaign has mustered a lot of opinion against compromise with the Taliban.
ما خوش نداریم که هر روز یک انسان کشته شود. یک انسان. شما 50,000 انسان میگین درست؟ ولی ما میخوایم میره پرسان بکنم که تضمین وقتی که شما بر من میگین که ما آماده قربانی باشم تضمین چی است که جنگ ختم شود؟ چطور شاید امکان داشته باشه این جنگ یک جنگ دیگر شروع کنه؟ این چه کسی بر ما تضمین میکنه؟ چون گفتم ما طالبان رو نمیشناسیم. طالبان میالم در جنگ هستن.
This poses a dilemma for Shahrazad Akbar. As the head of Afghanistan's Human Rights Commission, she has always advocated for women's rights, but she is also in favor of peace talks.
There are friends of mine, people who tell me, how can you say this? Talking with Taliban is giving legitimacy to a terrorist group.
Interesting.
How can you say this? Don't you understand the human rights record of the Taliban? They're against everything that you stand for.
And what did you say?
And I say, I also see what this war is doing to us. We also have a message for Taliban. it's not that we or anyone is in a position to forgive their human rights record or the government's human rights record. That's not what we are saying. We are saying if we want to create opportunities for more Afghans to benefit from their basic human rights, we should try to reduce violence. And the best way to reduce violence without causing more damage is to initiate talks.
In the summer of 2019, Akbar went to Doha along with other prominent Afghans to meet the Taliban. She pushed Khairkhwah and his comrades on where they stood on women's rights, but his answers were too opaque to reassure her.
مثلا که زه وایم چې موږ د ښځو لپاره تعلیم کوو هغه وایي چې طالبان هر څه چینج سوي دي غواړي دا دې دپاره سبب وګوري چې په طالبانو کې دننه اختلاف راولي چې ولې دا خبره کوله بل دا کوله که وایم چې نه د ښځو تعلیم لپاره شی نشته هغه وایي وره د ښځو تعلیم بند کړی دي یعنې هغوی د دې نه غلط هغه مسایل چې دغه ځکه موږ هغه اوس پرېښي دي چې کله ځای رالی د ځای نه مخکې هغه ته ګټه نه رسوي هغوی د بغیر د دې نه چې د هغوی نه دښمن پروپاګنډه جوړه کړي ځکه موږ دا نه وایو.
I felt like there was a lot of rehearsed
Right, it's a sort of standard line. So when the Taliban say they're committed to protecting the rights of women that have been given to them by the sacred religion of Islam, what does that mean?
I asked them this in Doha. For Taliban to claim that they have monopoly over Islam is absolutely outrageous and not acceptable to anyone.
Despite the tensions and mistrust, by February 2020, the Americans and the Taliban managed to pull off a deal. The Taliban paraded to the signing ceremony triumphant. Maybe they didn't win the war, but the Americans had failed to defeat them. And the United States was finally admitting it.
It doesn't show our victory, but definitely it shows the loss and the weakness of the Americans and all other foreign troops, foreign countries who have troops in Afghanistan.
Inside a Doha hotel ballroom packed with dignitaries from around the world, an historic handshake between the U.S. Special Envoy for Afghanistan and a Taliban leader. Something hard to imagine in previous years. But this was not a peace deal yet. It was just a promise that the Americans would start pulling out their troops if the Taliban started talking with the Afghan government and other political factions. The Taliban also promised to prevent al-Qaeda and other groups from using Afghan soil for terrorism. But there was no ceasefire on the horizon, no vision for the future Afghan state. All of the hard stuff remained ahead. I felt excited by the prospect of peace, but also worried about how fragile it all was. There was a brief lull in the fighting, and then the killing continued. The Americans went ahead with some troop withdrawals, but the Taliban and the Afghan government kept up the bloody assaults. Hamdullah Mohib knows the terrible toll this war has taken on his soldiers and on civilians. But he fears that putting faith in peace talks could unleash a chaotic chain of events.
I think the word peace gives warmth to everyone's heart. People immediately assume that we will have stability. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. If you strong arm us into accepting whatever deal you strike, you are going to banish us from our own country. We would be seen as traitors. There would be no space. There would be no room for us. The Taliban are extremists. So you may see a bloodbath on the streets of Kabul. So, this was not a simple matter of negotiation and a difference of opinion over policy. This is about the future of my country, my people, quite literally our lives.
It seems the only thing more divisive than 20 years of war is the struggle about how to end it.
من فکر میکنم این تضاد خیلی عمیق است و در چند سال آینده ما نمیتونیم این از بین ببریم و خب امیدوار هستیم یک روز مجبور نباشیم طالبان تحمل کنیم دوباره. نه اونا قبول میکنن نه با ما، دو طرفه قبول نیست. به خاطر که اونا در جامعه خود بزرگ شدن، ما در جامعه خود بزرگ شدیم.
Already, threats to her life have forced Farnaz Frotan to flee the country. Shahrazad Akbar has seen more human rights workers murdered, and she knows that she could be next.
People want peace. That's one thing. How they want it is subject to different interpretations, different groups, different ethnicities, different areas. Having said that, they want also that the Taliban to compromise with the other Afghans. That's the two things. Nobody wants to go to the Taliban rule of 1994 to 2001. And nobody wants the current corrupt government officials either. So there must be some sort in between.
I don't think I can ever reconcile myself with the damage we inflicted on this country. But this journey has inspired me because now, if you squint, you can almost see a chance for peace. It's achingly distant, and it could easily slip away. But I spent so many years troubled by the levels of violence climbing higher and higher. Now, for the first time, because of these peace talks, we have no idea what is going to happen next. The unknown is terrifying, but it also offers possibilities that no one could have believed existed. Maybe, the killing will end. For now, though, the streets remain dangerous. After school in Kandahar, the girls put their burqas back on and venture out into an uncertain future.